Um, Back to Psalm 25. Probably some explanation is in order here. I'm doing several each day because I'm coming into a season where Debbie and I are going to be traveling a ton, and I don't know what kind of time and availability I'm going to have to be able to put something new up every day. So, yeah, same T-shirt, same day. Anyway, okay, we're Psalm 25. Um, I really like verse 9. So far, there hasn't been a verse I haven't liked. He guides the humble in what is right, and he teaches them his way. Humility is the key for me to learn God's ways and be able to live according to his design. I've shared this before, but in my counseling, my I guess I'd call it my motto is helping you find your best life by discovering God's design and living within it. That's the reason. The what makes that possible? Two things: the goodness of God and my humility. That's the only way I will learn his good ways. Verse 10, all the ways of the Lord are loving and faithful toward those who keep the demands of his covenant. Ooh, this is a conditional thing. All the ways of the Lord are loving and faithful. God's ways. We've been talking about, or thinking through learning God's ways. All of those ways are loving and faithful. In other words, how can a way be loving and faithful? In this, I think, in this way, the intention of the way, this path, this design, is for our best. It kind of, in the New Testament, the verse that probably best connects with this thought is in Romans 8:28, where he says, and we know that in all things God is at work for the good of those who love him and are called according to his purpose. Well, the design of God's way is always for our best. It's always for our good. Go back to the idea that some things that are for our good are not fun to get through, and yet they produce a very good outcome in us. All right, all the ways of the Lord, not some of them, not just a few cherry-picked, all the ways. All? And we're going to see in a minute here that we're talking about not just this fuzzy goodness of God and this general way. David's going to connect it with something very specific. All the ways of the Lord are loving and faithful toward those who keep the demands of his covenant. That's the condition. There's a couple of things that one thing that we're not going to like at all, and that is that idea of demands. When I say the word demand, you get a warm, fuzzy feeling from that? I don't. I kind of don't like to have someone demand something from me. I'm generally okay with being asked, but not demanded. Well, that might need to hold out onto your trousers here, because God can and does demand things of us. And David says it's the demands of his covenant. Where do you find his covenant? Well, the primary covenant, I mean, there are several, actually, many covenants. Maybe it would be a little better to think of it as many expressions of one covenant. The covenant is he will be our God and we will be his people. He started this with Abraham. That's, well, in fact, with Adam and Eve, but he expressed it very clearly, quite clearly, with Abraham, and throughout Jewish history, the idea that he would be our one and only God, and we would be his people. That started on a racial basis with the Jews. And because of God's goodness and mercy, he has extended it to us who are not Jews because of Jesus and grace. Well, okay, let's think about this. There are demands in his covenant. And I think it's bigger than this, but a place to go to get the central essence of the law, the covenant, is in the Ten Commandments, Exodus chapter 20. And that all begins with regard for God. That he is the one and only God, and he demands our worship. And no other God. There are no other gods. Do not worship any other God. Don't even make an image of another God. And then the other 7 commandments have to do with when a person has grounded themselves in this concept, this covenant concept, that there is only one true God and no other God, no other thing or object, only the one true God. And for the Israelites, it was Yahweh. And the third of the commands is do not take the name of the Lord your God in vain, meaning don't misuse the name of the Lord. And the early Jews were so concerned that they not break that command that they chose to not utter the name of God. And so they dropped some letter characters out of it and came up with Yahweh. We don't even know what the original word name for God was. Okay. Bunny trails. You are loving and faithful toward those who keep the demands of your covenant. That's the condition. Does God love me more when I obey and less when I don't? You might get that impression here. This is how I've resolved that. I think that I am less able to comprehend and apprehend and embrace God's love if I'm not keeping the demands of his covenant. I'm most able to see, feel, understand, comprehend, apprehend God's love and faithfulness when I am living according to his design. Now, as people on this side of the cross, the question always that I hear is, so do the 10 Commandments and all that covenant stuff, does that still apply to us? Jesus said, I didn't come to abolish the law, I came to fulfill it. And that leaves an implication that The law, the law is still there. And it still is, I don't know whether the word binding is the right word, but it still is valid. Excuse me. Paul devoted an entire letter to the church in Galatia to the idea that we are no longer bound by the law. But it's grace that has reconciled us to God, because nobody has been able to perfectly observe and follow the law except for Jesus. So now we have this law, all of those 10 commandments, including the idea of the Sabbath, are valid. Now, when you get into the extension of all of that into the 300 or 500, depending on who you read and accept in terms of scholarship, the itemized law, okay, there are things there, foods you can and cannot eat, things you can and cannot do, that, okay, when Jesus fulfilled the law and those are no longer binding on us, the principle still remains. These are for our good. The Lord, you are loving and faithful. Your ways are loving and faithful toward those who keep the demands of his law. As Americans, I think we hackle at the idea that God demands certain things, but he does. Can he be demanding and loving at the same time? Yes. And here's, for me, I'm still trying to verbalize it and get my mind wrapped around the idea that because of God's grace, the demands don't go away. But because of God's grace, I have a power, I have an energy, I have an ability outside of myself that comes to me from outside of myself to be able to meet the demands. See, my old way of thinking is God was just waiting for me to step out of line so that he could smack me. He was like, he's a police officer, right? But he didn't give tickets. He gave punches in the nose. I don't think that's true. Does he still have demands? Well, yeah. His demands are still in place. But I have what David didn't. I have the grace of God poured out onto and into me. And this is in the person of the Holy Spirit who lives in me to empower me, among other things, to be able to observe the demands, to keep the demands of his covenant with me. This is pretty heavy stuff. Now, verse 11, for this, and it really follows logically, for the sake of your name, Lord, forgive my iniquity, though it is great. First of all, he admits, I'm a great sinner. I've committed many sins. This is not something small that could be winked at. No. I'm a big-time sinner. Paul said he believed he was the worst of all, or the greatest of all sinners. For your sake, for the sake of your name, Lord, forgive my iniquity, though it is great. Now, we got to come back to the idea of for the sake of your name, and we will next time on So Care with Stevie Boy.